Hey everybody, so today we're looking at the results of different sleep trackers, consumer wearable sleep trackers like the Whoop, to see if they're useful at all for tracking sleep apnea or UARS. And I've always wanted to do this for myself because I would like to track the progress along certain treatments or to see if something is helping or if lifestyle factors affect my sleep. So I'm excited for this, and I used 5 different sleep trackers over 2 nights, compared all the results to a medically validated diagnostic device, the WatchPAT. So many of you know about this. It's used to detect obstructive sleep apnea, but also UARS because it picks up on respiratory effort-related arousals. So if you've been, diagnosed with sleep disordered breathing and want to know if any of these kind of wearable consumer devices that don't require prescription, can help you track your progress or understand your sleep better, or if you're just curious, which kinds of trackers might actually tell you something meaningful about your sleep quality, this could be an interesting video for you. So I'll be completely upfront. None of the consumer trackers reliably detect brief arousals from sleep. So short awakenings or state shifts in sleep that happen with respiratory disturbances during sleep. So some trackers picked up on a few of these events and some more than others, but it's not nearly enough to really be useful for people with obstructive sleep apnea or UARS. There is some nuance there, especially for people with obstructive sleep apnea. Oxygen desaturations can sometimes, show up in trackers that include SpO2 monitoring. We'll go into that a bit later. But beyond, sleep tracking for sleep quality and people with sleep disordered breathing, it raises interesting questions. Are sleep trackers actually helpful? Can they be misleading and counterproductive? And how far do they actually measure sleep quality? As well, though, there's one particularly interesting medical device, the Sunrise sensor, which I tested as well. It was a consumer device when I got it, but now is classified as medical, requires a prescription. And it takes a completely different approach to tracking sleep. And it measures as well the respiratory effort required throughout the night for a person to breathe. So it's very interesting. Stick around, stay tuned, or jump ahead to whatever part you're interested in most. And yeah, let's dive into it. Now, what exactly did I test? So I compared 6 sleep trackers, 4 consumer wearables, and 2 FDA-approved medical devices. So the 4 consumer wearables are listed first in this table, and they are the Whoop 4.0, the Sleep Squared app by the company Nuqua, which was paired with the Polar Verity Sense for measurements, the Apple Watch Series 8 using the HeartWatch and Auto Sleep apps, and the Muse S Gen 2 headband. So for a quick overview, all of them include sleep staging and heart rate tracking. Most estimate respiratory rate except for the Polar Verity Sense. The Whoop and Sleep Squared don't track movement, and only the Apple Watch and Whoop measure blood oxygen levels. Finally, the Muse is unique in that it tracks EEG, brainwaves, and sleep position. As for the medical grade devices, I tested the Sunrise sensor and the WatchPAT 300. So the Sunrise and the WatchPAT, they're in a different league altogether from the consumer wearables. They're FDA approved to help diagnose sleep disordered breathing. And the Sunrise does that by detecting mandibular jaw movements, so micro movements or oscillations of the lower jaw, which strongly correlate with respiratory effort. The WatchPAT, on the other hand, uses peripheral arterial tonometry, which picks up on small changes in blood flow caused by spikes in activity of the sympathetic nervous system that happen whenever you experience an apnea or increased respiratory effort. And for this video, I'm mainly comparing everything against the WatchPAT 300, which has essentially become the gold standard for home sleep testing. It's clinically validated with about 89% correlation of AHI when compared to polysomnographies. And one other detail, before anyone thinks, the more check marks on this table, the better, that's not necessarily true. What matters isn't so much how many metrics the device tracks, but whether those metrics actually tell you something useful about your sleep quality and, in our case here, your breathing. Which brings us to what would a good consumer tracker theoretically need to be useful for somebody with sleep disordered breathing? Well, for obstructive sleep apnea, the main signs are pretty clear. So you'll probably see some measurable oxygen drops, spikes in heart rate and respiratory rates around the time of those oxygen drops in apneas, hypopneas, and probably some movement as well. So if your tracker measures SpO2, heart rate, respiratory rate, you should be able to see some patterns that correlate with apneas or hypopneas. For UARS, though, it's a different story. You know, UARS involves smaller breathing disturbances, so-called flow limitations, and they often don't cause measurable oxygen drops in me at all, really. They can trigger micro-arousals, but oftentimes these are just so brief that most trackers just miss them. They don't necessarily cause spikes in heart rate. So to detect, you know, or have something interesting to say for people with URS, I think a tracker would need to be really sensitive to small changes in heart rate, respiratory rate, and subtle awakenings. So let's see how these trackers actually stack up to these kind of requirements. And quickly how I tested. So first off, I measured 2 nights of data. The first night with my CPAP and MAT device, so just the usual treatment on a typical night, and the second night without any treatment. So this theoretically allows us to see for each device if there's a difference in measurements between the 2 nights. And second, I was comparing the results for each device against the WatchPAT results, trusting that the WatchPAT is the most accurate in picking up respiratory events throughout the night. One last thing before we go into the results is how did I pick which wearables to test? Well, firstly, I went off research the Quantified Scientist, a YouTuber who tested a lot of different wearables against polysomnographies on himself and others, and who's done just an amazing job overviewing some of the best, most accurate wearables for sleep. I'll put a link to his YouTube in the show notes. It's great. I highly recommend it. Second, you know, I used the devices that were available to me. And third, I wanted to have devices with slightly different ways of measuring sleep. So some combination of heart rate variability, SpO2, respiratory rates, the mandibular movements, and EEG. All right, so without further ado, how do these trackers actually perform? So first, how good are the trackers at detecting different stages of sleep? And evaluating this is easiest by just reviewing the literature and the studies done for each of the devices. So most trackers are pretty good at detecting and predicting the general stages of sleep like light, deep, and REM. And that's indicated here in this graph as the Cohen's kappa, the K here, where anything above 0 is above chance, and a K between 0.8 and 1 is a near perfect prediction. So the Muse and the Sleep Squared, they perform on par with the FDA-approved medical devices and slightly better than the Whoop or Apple Watch. By the way, I couldn't find data on some of the other Muse's coefficients here. So it's in the lower right corner. And among all the trackers, it does have the highest Cohen's kappa at 0.78. Now, keep in mind that the consumer wearable trackers, they were at least trained probably on a general population. And these coefficients may not hold up for people with sleep disordered breathing, right? So the predictions might not be as accurate for people with SDB. But while sleep staging accuracy is important, I don't think it's the most important thing that we want to capture. And ideally, a tracker would be able to capture wake periods and especially small awakenings or arousals pretty accurately if we want to track sleep disordered breathing. Now, here we can look back at the graph and see that as it turns out, most of the trackers are pretty good at detecting whether somebody is asleep. So this is the tracker's sensitivity on the y-axis here. For all of them, when they predict that a person is asleep, the prediction agrees with polysomnographies more than 90% of the time. But accuracy falls by a lot for most of these wearables when it comes to accurately predicting whether a person is awake or not, the tracker's specificity on the x-axis. And specificity remains high for the medical devices and only the Sleep Squared app by Nuqua among the consumer wearables. So here, you know, the specificity is about as high as its sensitivity. So looking at the results, let's start with the WatchPAT just to see where my baseline is. And for both nights, something weird happened. The device just stopped recording about halfway through the night, around 4 hours in. I have no idea why. Maybe the finger sensor slipped, or maybe it thought I was awake too long. Strange that it happened 2 nights in a row, but still, data for the first half of the night is useful. So sorry the results are in German, by the way, but we see here that the first treatment night where I was using the CPAP and the MAT device were a lot better than on the second night without treatment. And you see that from the fact that my apneas and hypopneas were basically under control. So my AHI is near 0, but I still had a fair number of RERAs, especially during REM, with around 24 per hour. And that seems actually quite typical for someone with residual upper airway resistance. I've seen it in others where even after treating the obstructive component of their apnea, they have a lot of remaining RERAs, and it explains why I'm still tired on a lot of the days. Then on the untreated night, things changed a lot. So my RDI jumped by about 40%, and my AHI was 6.9, which technically puts me in the mild OSA, obstructive sleep apnea range. And then also looking at the graphs for respiratory events and heart rate, there seems to be a pattern where most of those breathing events, they seem to be clustered during REM sleep, and they're often followed or preceded by spikes in heart rate, though spikes in heart rate don't always seem to correspond with respiratory event and vice versa. So this is a pattern in sympathetic activation that we'll try to map against consumer wearable trackers as well to see if we can read anything out of the data and signals that they produce. So with that in mind, let's see how the consumer trackers held up. And for most, we'll go through the results of the bad night first, since presumably if a tracker can't pick up anything on the non-treatment night where there were more events, then it won't be able to pick up on anything during the treatment night either. So starting with the Whoop, and again, to reiterate, the WatchPAT only recorded the first 4 hours of the night, so we'll be focusing on the first half of the recordings. And as we can see here, the Whoop detected 2 of the wake periods that the WatchPAT did, but seemed to miss one in the middle. And overall, there are very few wake events, and none of them correspond to respiratory events on the WatchPAT, as we were hoping that they might. So, but what about spikes in heart rate? Well, in theory, the Whoop should have an advantage over some of the other trackers since it samples heart rate at a high frequency, about 50 to 100 times per second, which means it should pick up on the same heart rate spikes you see in the WatchPAT data. But the problem is that the app itself doesn't really show that detail clearly. It shows a minute-to-minute heart rate resolution, which, though it's a finer time scale than some of the other trackers, the time axis is just too coarse to really be able to pinpoint those spikes in heart rate. So looking at the Whoop's heart rate graph for the night, it looks very flat compared to the WatchPAT. And even if we crop and then scale the image, make the peaks more apparent, they still look like nothing like the WatchPATs and miss a lot of the heart rate spikes. And this was a bit surprising to me. I never realized the low resolution here in the app. I always had a feeling that looking at the heart rate graph in the morning was at least telling me something. But turns out, unless you have many heart rate spikes or increases in heart rate throughout the night, the minute-to-minute resolution just will probably miss most of them. And it's going to look, well, probably more like mine, pretty flat, insignificant, and healthy. Just to add, that's not to say the device itself isn't using the full data that's available to it for sleep staging, etc. That's probably what it's doing. It just calls into question the usefulness of these heart rate graphs, and not just in the Whoop, but for all of the trackers. Now, the Sleep Squared app with the Polar Verity Sense, this one surprised me. On paper, it looks great. The Verity Sense can sample heart rate at 135 hertz, which is high, but the Sleep Squared app itself, it reports even fewer data points than the Whoop. So during the first half of the no treatment night, if we look a little bit closer, we see the reporting intervals are probably once every 10 to 20 minutes. Compare this to the Whoop and the WatchPAT readings on the right. So the Sleep Squared shows just one of the larger spikes in heart rate. And that's not to say, the algorithm doesn't actually use the full data stream from the sensor. It probably does for predicting sleep stages, etc. And one could probably extract this somehow to some open source software where you can see a finer resolution. But again, the heart rate graph here in the app itself seems pretty useless. But the reason I was originally excited about the Sleep Squared app was because it has a higher specificity than the other trackers. And we discussed specificity earlier, where the device is good at detecting when a person is awake. So I thought the Sleep Squared app might actually be able to pick up on some more of these short micro-awakenings and arousals due to RERAs or apneas. And well, if we look closer at the awakenings recorded by the Sleep Squared app, it didn't seem to pick up on many in the first half of the night, but it did capture a lot of short awakenings in the later half of the night when sleep became lighter and REM was more dominant. So compare this to what the Whoop recorded with far fewer awakenings, 12 in total, for the Whoop versus the 38 recorded throughout the night for the Sleep Squared app. Unfortunately, since the WatchPAT had stopped recording for the second half of the night, we can't compare those later awakenings to see if they correspond to respiratory events. If I had to guess, they probably would for the most part, but it would have been interesting to see. And comparing the Sleep Squared recordings between the two nights, the app reported more of these awakenings during the non-treatment than in the treatment night, which makes sense. So it seems that even if Sleep Squared is not precise enough to quantify all the micro-arousals and awakenings, the app might at least be sensitive to overall sleep fragmentation, which could make it useful for tracking relative changes in sleep quality between nights, for instance. So I know this little study of mine is not a lot to go off of and is overall slim evidence, but if you're trying to see whether your therapy or lifestyle changes are helping, Sleep Squared might actually give you a sense of direction. I know Nuqua is doing studies now with people who have sleep apnea, and I would love to see them work on making the Sleep Squared app more sensitive and to come up with some kind of sleep fragmentation index that users are able to track. And moving on to the Apple Watch 8. So first off, Apple provides different apps that analyze and visualize the data, and I used HeartWatch and AutoSleep. The AutoSleep app is supposed to be very detailed and technical, so exactly what we're looking for, and that will be the app we're looking at here. But this one was a bit of a letdown. It's obvious here from the first glance at the hypnograph here that the Apple Watch definitely doesn't capture shorter awakenings like the Sleep Squared or the Whoop. And for the non-treatment night, it captured 3 awakenings versus 12 for the Whoop and 38 for the Sleep Squared. From what I could find online, the heart rate sampling rate is technically around 25 to 50 hertz. But if you look at the heart rate graph, you can already tell compared to the other devices that this graph is so smoothed out over so few data points that you really can't tell much from it. And a quick look at the other apps tells us that the heart rate is reported between 1 to 10 minutes at random intervals. Same with the oxygen saturation, which are the green dots here up top, and the respiratory rate, which is the green line at the bottom of the graph here. So these are just spot checked a few times per night. Now, something interesting is that the Apple Watch tracks ambient noise, and I honestly didn't think that this would be useful. But when I zoomed in on the graphs, the noise spikes actually line up pretty well with where the Sleep Squared showed awakenings, and presumably the WatchPAT would have in the second half of the night had it been recording. So the noise could reflect, positional shifts, mouth leaks, mask noises, all sorts of little disturbances that sometimes do correspond with arousals. And obviously, it's far too rough to help as a diagnostic or anything, but this type of movement or restlessness causing noise, it might just surprisingly be the best proxy for respiratory events that we've seen so far in the consumer trackers. Now let's talk about the Muse, which I was really curious about since it's the only one that's an EEG and measures brain waves. And on paper, that sounds like it would be great for detecting micro-awakenings, but in practice, not really, not in this instance. First of all, just looking at the sleep staging, it's not particularly helpful with few reported awakenings, though we have seen from the literature that the Muse has the highest accuracy in terms of sleep staging among the consumer wearable devices. But also looking at the actual brainwave data here, divided by the different power bands in different colors, as you can see, you might think that these spikes could be cortical arousals from sleep, but they're more likely artifacts from any kind of movement. Though, sure, a lot of them or some of them might be correlated with arousals as well. And to detect true cortical arousals, apparently in a polysomnography, you'd find short bursts of alpha or beta activity that interrupt delta and theta rhythms. So you can tell here from the resolution in the app, it's just too low with everything compressed on this time scale here to detect arousals in that kind of detail. And to actually use the Muse EEG data for this purpose, I think you would need to export the raw EEG data and analyze it in more depth. So apparently this is possible with the Muse monitor, and it's something I'd like to try in the future. And maybe some of the viewers have already done this and can give some feedback on their experience. But even then, and I could be wrong here, I suspect that the sampling rate is much lower than what you get in a polysomnography. Besides, you just have fewer EEG electrodes with the Muse and more messy data that's limiting your precision. But what's nice with the Muse is that right underneath the brainwave data, you have data on body movement and heart rate. So what you could try is to line up your heart rate, movement, and spikes in the EEG to maybe get a better idea of where arousals are happening. But even if you added up all those spikes here in either of the nights, you'll get far less total than the overall number of respiratory events counted by the WatchPAT. At least that was the case for me. And also nice with the Muse, it seems that the heart rate sampling rate reported here in the app is much more detailed than with the other devices. And apparently you can also export the PPG, the heart rate data, into Muse Monitor as well. And another area where the Muse stands out is in tracking sleep position. And this is in and of itself really helpful for people who have a sleep positional aspect to their sleep disordered breathing. So it could be helpful for those who are training themselves to not sleep on their backs in order to help treat their apnea, and or for people who just want to see if their sleep is worse in certain positions versus others. Now, finally, on to the Sunrise sensor, which is a really interesting device. And it shouldn't be lumped in with consumer wearables because it's also a medical grade device with FDA clearance for detecting sleep disordered breathing. And instead of measuring blood flow like the WatchPAT, it measures tiny jaw movements that correlate with respiratory effort. And rather than showing every individual event here, it gives you a timeline of your respiratory disturbance index throughout the night, along with other metrics like fragmentation, bruxism, and something called respiratory effort percentage. And in my test, the Sunrise reported an RDI, or respiratory disturbance index, of about 11 per hour, while the WatchPAT showed or reported 14.4. Now that's really close, but I did find in a study of the Sunrise that it tends to underestimate arousals or respiratory disturbances, in people with higher RDIs. Also, what stood out and was interesting was that the device reported a separate fragmentation index, which for me was higher at 19 per hour. And this means the device picks up on additional arousals or stage shifts that weren't necessarily linked to breathing events. So things like limb movements. And here's a really interesting part of the Sunrise, the respiratory effort metric. So mine came back as 76% of the night spent with increased effort, which is considered high, apparently. And I honestly had no idea how they calculate this at first, but apparently it's based on subtle oscillations in mandibular muscle activity, tiny micro movements that increase when you're working harder to breathe. And they can measure that throughout the night. And what's fascinating about this is that it reframes the whole way we think about sleep disordered breathing. So instead of just counting discrete events, these respiratory disturbances, it's measuring how much your system is working throughout the night. So the idea being that high effort means your nervous system is constantly on alert, trying hard to breathe, even if your oxygen levels stay stable, perhaps. And that this higher effort is increasing your sympathetic nervous system activity, and it's lowering your arousal threshold, making deep sleep harder to maintain, and arousals from sleep more likely. And you might rightfully think, well, this could just be a new metric they've come up with for marketing purposes and to set themselves apart from competitors. Well, that's probably true, but apparently the Sunrise used machine learning models trained against polysomnographies, and polysomnographies using esophageal pressure catheters, so ESP. And ESP is kind of the gold standard in diagnosing UARS and in measuring overall respiratory effort. So this new effort metric, or at least from what I've seen, at least in home sleep studies, could be a great new indicator, especially for people with UARS, but I think also for anyone for that matter. So you may not have a diagnosable sleep condition or sleep disordered breathing condition, but you might still be on the upper ranges of the bell curve in terms of the effort to breathe that you're exerting at night, which is contributing to poor sleep and fragmenting your sleep. And you would never know otherwise. And this is not something that would be tested for otherwise. So I think it's really interesting that they have this now in the Sunrise. But moving on, the sunrise doesn't give you full sleep staging, just awake versus asleep, which is fine for what it's designed to do. It does track sleep position, which is a nice bonus. So you can see how much time you spend on your back versus your side. And it does show you how much or how many respiratory disturbances happened while sleeping on your back, which is helpful for people to know whether or not they have positional apnea. And finally, this bruxism index is also nice to see because it's not always obvious, even to dentists, I've realized whether or not you have bruxism. And it doesn't just affect your enamel, so your teeth essentially, and your TMJ, but it can also contribute to gum recession and arousals from sleep itself. So it would have been nice for me, for instance, to be able to pick up on this earlier, so that I could have started with a bite guard, for instance, many years back. All right, so those are the results. And for the big picture, the two medical devices, WatchPAT and Sunrise, they're really the only ones designed to detect sleep apnea and UARS. They both require a prescription, so that just means they're not something you can use and just wear every night, which is the reason why I made this YouTube and this little study to begin with. And so when it comes to consumer wearables, they're actually pretty good at tracking your sleep stages and total sleep time. But they can't pick up on those tiny awakenings, the micro-arousals or stage shifts of sleep disordered breathing. And this is probably not by accident. So most of these devices, they filter out these small awakenings and a lot of noise in the data on purpose to make your sleep graphs look smoother and everything easier to read. And then from a marketing standpoint, that makes a lot of sense. But it also just means you're not seeing the full story of your sleep in these graphs and in a lot of the data. That said, we did learn a few interesting things. The Whoop and the Muse stand out for their heart rate tracking. So they both have high sampling frequencies, which means their heart rate graphs are detailed enough that you can actually see small spikes that line up with arousals. And if you overlay them with medical data, you'll notice they sometimes catch those sympathetic bursts that follow or precede respiratory events. The Sleep Squared app paired with the Polar Verity Sense was the best among the consumer trackers for picking up brief awakenings. We just can't tell how many of those awakenings correspond to respiratory effort or disturbances, and vice versa, how many of those were just spontaneous. Still, the device and the app are noticeably more sensitive to sleep fragmentation than the other trackers, and it seems it could be useful for tracking sleep quality in people with SDB. The Whoop came in second, though it picked up only 12 awakenings versus the 38 recorded by the Sleep Squared, while the Apple Watch and Muse barely picked up on any at all, just a few. Now, I was a bit surprised by the Apple Watch because while it does record an impressive amount of data, including respiratory rate, oxygen levels, in addition to heart rate, they're all reported at such large intervals and smoothed out so much in the graphs that it seems basically useless beyond just calculating an average for the night. One surprising, interesting metric though, the Apple Watch tracks ambient noise, and both the Apple Watch and the Muse record movement. And both of those seem to correlate, at least with awakenings reported by the Sleep Squared app. And it just makes sense that every time I woke up or shifted after a respiratory event, I would move or make noise. And that's what the Apple Watch and the Muse would then pick up on. As for oxygen saturation, none of these wearables continuously monitor SpO2. They just take spot checks, sometimes only a few per night. So they completely miss short desaturations. And I wonder if for people with more purely obstructive types of sleep apnea, if even having an SpO2 monitor instead of these wearables would be the most useful way to help track and manage their sleep apnea on a continual basis and just track their sleep quality as well. In the Muse, it seems not only to sample, but also to report its data in high resolution in the graphs, which is nice. Though to really dig into the data and manipulate the graphs to actually spot true cortical arousals, we need to try exporting the raw EEG and heart rate data. And this could be interesting and is something I want to try in the future. And if others have tried that, please let me know. But of course, that then falls outside of what a casual wearable is meant for, to easily track your sleep every day. So personally, among the consumer wearables, I found the most useful indicators for poor sleep were the awakenings on the Sleep Squared app, the heart rate spikes on the Whoop, and the reported movement on the Muse. But even then, it's a really incomplete picture, more like a rough sketch of your sleep. And I'm not going to wear 3 devices to bed every night and study and overlay these graphs every day. Now, the Sleep Squared app by Nuqua, it looks really promising. Its high specificity means it's really good at recognizing wake phases and maybe more of these small awakenings. And the company behind it is actually running studies right now to see how well their app can help detect sleep apnea. So I'm really curious to see how that research is going to turn out. So yes, the results of this study here are a bit of a letdown. None of the consumer wearables are really accurate when it comes to measuring sleep fragmentation or sleep quality. And the only exception right now, apparently, is the Apple Watch 10, which recently got FDA approval for sleep apnea detection. And it uses its accelerometer to measure subtle breathing pattern changes, which sounds great. But the catch is that it follows the strictest scoring rule by the AASM, which only counts apneas and hypopneas that cause a 4% oxygen drop. That's fine for obstructive sleep apnea for many, but it means it won't catch milder breathing issues and UARS. And even in Apple's own studies, the watch correctly identified OSA in about 2/3 of cases. So 1 out of 3 people with obstructive sleep apnea would still fall through the cracks if they were just going by this new consumer wearable. And lastly, to talk about what really stood out for me was the Sunrise. This device, it really deserves more attention. And the fact that it measures respiratory effort through mandibular movement is super interesting. And it's the first of its kind to get FDA clearance for this approach. And it can detect RERAs and subtle breathing disturbances, so not just full apneas, by measuring the frequency and amplitude of those tiny jaw movements at night. And the WatchPAT detects RERAs really reliably and is super helpful for people with UARS as well. But I think the respiratory effort metric with the Sunrise is really valuable because it gives you a new way of understanding sleep-disordered breathing. So not just as isolated events and respiratory disturbances, but as a kind of continuous physiological strain that affects your nervous system all throughout the night. And it's also a metric that I think could be relevant for anybody, including people whose sleep issues maybe, aren't at the level of a diagnosable sleep condition or sleep disordered breathing, but where respiratory effort at night is still high enough to be contributing to overall sleep fragmentation and poor sleep. And the Sunrise is also small, accessible, and could be even used in rural areas or in places without sleep labs. So just thinking from the standpoint of my background in public health, it would really help if more providers adopted it along with the WatchPAT to reduce waiting lists and make proper diagnosis more accessible as well as treatment. Also, because with its focus on respiratory strain and effort, the Sunrise just has awareness raising about UARS and breathing during sleep kind of essentially built into it. So providers and patients become more aware of even subtle breathing issues and obstructions and their importance for their sleep. So in conclusion, if you have sleep apnea or UARS, I wouldn't rely on fitness trackers to track the quality of your sleep or how well your treatment is working. And if you suspect you have sleep apnea or UARS, definitely don't rely on a smartwatch or a fitness tracker to tell you. In that case, go talk to your doctor, get a proper polysomnography, or if possible, use something like the WatchPAT or the Sunrise. Both are accurate, clinically validated, and can actually detect breathing-related arousals and disturbances. And personally, I've used the WatchPAT about 5 or 6 times now, mostly because it's just so much easier than going into a sleep lab for the night. And honestly, for conditions like UARS, even lab-based polysomnographies can vary a lot depending on how carefully the sleep tech scores those subtle RERAs, whether they score them at all. Some labs miss them altogether. Some don't even know about UARS. So that's a whole nother topic that I'll cover in a future video though. But even for people without sleep disordered breathing or who haven't had it diagnosed yet and don't know they have it, there's an interesting takeaway here. And that is just don't let your wearable or your tracker convince you that your sleep is perfect just because it shows pretty charts and green circles. Your sleep, it could look great on the app which it does for me a lot of the times, but still be physiologically terrible and a wreck, apparently. So does that mean that these devices are actually misleading? Well, I'm not sure, and I think one could argue either way, but it seems they're just not built to detect some key important components of what makes sleep good or bad. But I think where they are helpful is in behavior change. So if you drink a lot of alcohol, stay up late, or eat heavy meals before bed, your sleep score will almost certainly drop unless you're 18, 19 years old or something. And that feedback loop can motivate you to make better choices. So in that sense, the trackers, they're acting more like sleep coaches than diagnostic tools. And the companies behind them would probably argue the same. And the reason behind that is just the algorithms in these trackers, they still don't account for autonomic balance, your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system and their activity, which is probably behind a lot of what makes up sleep quality. And what's ironic is that these devices already have the sensors to detect it. So the same optical sensors, the photoplethysmography, I hope I pronounced that right, or PPG sensors that measure blood flow could probably, with better algorithms, pick up on respiratory events and arousal-related changes in perfusion. That's pretty much literally how the WatchPAT works, just using a more precise pneumatic version of the same principle. So the potential is there, the technology is there, it just hasn't been fully used or built out yet. So I'd want to just finish this video by asking all the companies out there, Apple, Whoop, Aura, Garmin, startups, whatever, to help address this need, because millions of people have undiagnosed sleep disordered breathing. And I would guess as people become more aware of respiratory effort, the way the sunrise is measuring it and raising awareness about it, the market for trackers that capture this would grow as well. And we already have the hardware on our wrist, so it just makes sense. Please keep developing, validating, and training your algorithms to detect and measure these kind of micro-arousals, the respiratory effort, and overall sleep fragmentation. Because when these trackers can actually get into that kind of detail, that's when they will make a big difference. So thanks, everybody, and I'll talk to you next time.